Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's Jorge, and this time we are dressed like Neville Chamberlain or Winston Churchill, and we are playing my personal favorite, which is this one, Triumph and Tragedy, by GMT Games and Craig Besinque. So, this is, in my opinion, the best three-player designed game I have ever laid my hands on. Honestly, you will love it. In this game, three players are playing. One is the Axis, the Germans and Italians, during more or less the World War II. The other one is the Communist faction, or the Soviets. And the third one is the capitalists, the West, which comprises United Kingdom, France, and at some point in the game may be joined by the US allies. So, notice that the full title is Triumph and Tragedy, European Balance of Power, 1936 to 1945. So it's not exactly a historical recreation of World War II, more like a sandbox game, during which the war may break out earlier or later, or not even break out at all. There will be much diplomacy, much military might, and a lot of fun. So let's go! Okay, so what have we got here? This is the map. And let's have a look at what is there on this map. We've got the major powers, or rather the three great powers. Now, the map is divided into land areas, like this one, and sea areas, like this one. There is a distinction that this one, the dark blue, is the home territory of Britain, which comprises two land areas, London, Glasgow, and also Canada is considered a home territory for the British. And then there is France, which comprises these four land areas. All this is home territory, and you will understand the significance of it shortly. And then we've got USSR, which is this one, all these red land areas, it's USSR home territory. And then there is the Axis, which includes Germany, these three land areas, rather four land areas, including this one, Königsberg. And so these four land areas are the German home territory. And then we've got Italy. These land areas is Italian home territory, this dark brown one, Milan, Venice, Rome, Taranto, Sicily, and Sardinia. This is Italian home territory. And besides that, we've got a bunch of colonies. Colonies are not home territory like what we just described. For the Italians, there is one colony only, and this is Libya. Libya includes these two land areas. Its capital is Tripoli, and also there is the land area of Cyrenaica. And then we've got some colonies for the French, which is French North Africa, this area, its capital being Algiers. And all these land areas belong to French North Africa. And also one more colony, which is Syria, its capital being Damascus. These two are the French colonies. Then we've got some colonies for the British, which is, for example, Middle East. Its capital is Suez, and whoever controls Suez pretty much controls all these vast areas. Also India, its capital being Delhi, these three land areas. All this is colonies, so I remind this is not home territory. Also we've got Gibraltar, which is a colony for the English, and Malta. And lastly, we've got the USA. USA starts as neutral, but may later join the west side, and it consists of these two land areas, Washington and New York. This is USA home territory. Now, all the rest of the land areas in this map, all these other colors, start as neutral countries. So, initially, all these countries, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, etc., are neutrals, and they may join some side diplomatically over the course of the game, or they may be conquered militarily. Some of them consist of a single land area, like Hungary, for example, and some of them include multiple land areas, like Yugoslavia, for example, its capital being Belgrade, and also including this land area of Croatia. The map includes land areas and sea areas, and there are also some special kind of areas called straits, like this one, the Straits of Istanbul. You see these dashed circles. These are straits. They're land areas, like the rest of the land areas, but they've got some special purposes, some way they work as sea areas for some game purposes. And that's pretty much the map. So let's move on to the sequence of the game. We are playing since the year 1936, then 1937, etc., up until 1945. The game may last until 1945, and then at the end of it we conduct a kind of a final scoring. Then each year is divided into seasons or phases. So we've got the New Year phase, where we start the year and get some bonuses. And then we've got production, where we produce our military units and diplomatic cards, which we're going to talk about right next. And then we've got government, where we impact countries diplomatically. And then we've got 3 seasons each year, actually: spring, summer, a special blockade phase, then fall. And after these 3 seasons there is winter, which is almost moot, but it is very important for the Russians inside the Soviet Union. And then we start a new year again. So that's the sequence of the game. And right next we're going to talk about each phase separately. So, starting with the new year. Each year there is a basic sequence which we follow. Suppose we start in 1936. We reshuffle some decks. There are 2 decks in the game. There is the action deck, which includes these action cards, and the investment deck, which includes these investment cards. All cards that have been played are reshuffled. Then factions which are at peace draw these ones, which are called peace dividends. So it's time to mention that all 3 factions begin the game as rivals, which means they are not at war, they are in peace with each other, but they are kind of opponents. So they are termed rivals, but they are not enemies. At some point in the game, one power may declare war upon each other. And from this moment onwards, they are called enemies. So look at this marker, for example. This is West, and they are in peace with Axis and in peace with USSR as well. So if West declares war onto the Axis, we flip this marker, which is flipped on the declaration of war on Axis side. And from that moment onwards, the German player, of course, also moves his marker away, so they are both considered at war with each other, but still West and the Soviets are rivals, not yet enemies. When one of them declares war on the other, for example the West declares war on the Soviets, now they are enemies. West is an enemy to both of the other 2 players, but still Soviets might be rivals to Germans. Maybe the war has not broken out there yet. So, going back to the peace dividends. All factions start in peace, so in 1936 they will randomly draw 1 peace dividend sheet from the pool, and these sheets have got values of 0, 1 or 2. These are victory points, and it's a bit early to talk about victory, but just remember this, that in the New Year phase, factions that are at peace and have not fought a battle against some neutral in the previous year, actually factions that have not violated a neutral in the last year, get to draw a peace dividend, which may be of varying victory point value. And right next we are rolling a die, and this die determines the turn order for the rest of this year. So suppose we roll a 1, the turn order marker goes here. Or if it is a 2, it goes the other way. Or if it is a 3, it goes this way, etc., etc. Now, what does this mean? It means that for the rest of this year's phases, it will be the West player playing first, and then the turn order moves to the Axis, and then from the Axis it goes to the Soviets, and so on. After shuffling the decks, drawing possibly some peace dividends, and determining the turn order, the year is ready to start, and we move to the next phase, which is production. Let's go on with production. Starting with the player first in turn order, players conduct their production. In order to determine the production level, we consult these tracks. Each faction has its own production track. So there are 3 distinct values which you can see on this track. There is industry, there is resources, and there is population. Your production depends on these levels. So at first, when we are at peace, we consult population and industry. We ignore resources totally. So our production is the lowest one among these 2. So for example, in 1936, you will notice that the Western player has got an industry value of 7, a resource value of 11, and a population value of 12. So his production level will be 7, which is the lowest among industry and population. Forget about resources for now. But however, when factions are at war, the resource marker is flipped, and from this point onwards, we also consult the resource level. For example, at this stage, if the English player or the Western player manages to raise his industry, we also consult the resources as the lowest one value. So his production level will be at 11. So repeating, when at peace, ignore resources. Our production is the lowest among population and industry. And when we are at war, we also consult resources, and our production is the least of these 3. So for example, if we look at the German player, things are slightly different here. The German player starts with a resource level of 6 and the population level of 11. His industry is very strong early, it's on 12. So his production level is on 11 because we ignore resources. So the lowest of these 2 is the 11 value of population. But if he's declared war upon, or he starts a war, then we also have to take his resource level into account. So as you may later understand in the game, it might be a good idea to declare war on the Germans early, just to make them have some reduced production for the early stages of the game. More on that later. So it's time to determine what to do with our production. Our production might either be investment cards from this deck or action cards from this deck. I mean, 1 production value gets you 1 card, 2 production value gets you 2 cards, and so on. And the other option that we have is build military units. Let's look at this example. The game setup, there are some units that are set up here from the get-go. So for example, the British have got an infantry unit. This is the infantry unit in Karachi, this area of India. So during production, they may upgrade this unit, and by upgrading I mean we take this 1 combat value unit and we turn it into a 2 combat value unit. These pips or dots show the unit's combat value. Or we may build a new unit alternatively. Each production point either upgrades a unit once or builds a new unit, which is termed as cadre, a 1 combat value unit. Now, what are the restrictions? First of all, you cannot upgrade 1 unit or build 1 unit, as it is termed in this game, more than once per production. So each year you may raise each unit by 1 combat value, and you can only build the cadres in your home territory, not in colonies like this one, the only exception being these units, the forts. So in India, as a Western player, as the English, you can only build new forts, but otherwise you may only build up your already existing units. You cannot build other units in India, except if that is a fort. Another restriction is that only one fort may be in its land area. You build a fort and then you upgrade it, and this way you fortify one land area. Units can only be built in land areas, not at sea, and not if they are engaged in a battle, as we are gonna see later. For example, if there is one unit fighting a battle here, then you cannot upgrade your already engaged in a battle units. The last restriction is that the units must be in supply, and we're gonna talk about supply later. But if they are unsupplied, you cannot build them up. Just keep that in mind. On the map, you can see the resource point, its side controls, and the population values as well. For example, resources are this triangular symbol. For example, the Germans, at the start of the game, they've got 6 resources. 1 because they control Berlin, 1 resource point. 3 resource points for the industrial area of Ruhr. 1 for Milan and 1 for Venice. That's the Axis resources at the beginning. So as you may understand, the Axis player is in a kind of rush in the early game to secure more resources in order to guarantee for himself some better production level, which means more units built up and more cards drawn. So he will try to find resources probably around his neighbors in Croatia or generally in neutral countries, which he can try to subvert diplomatically or conquer militarily. And also you can see the population values on the cities and towns. So there is a beautiful chart right here. There are towns, which are the little dots. These got no population value. One example would be Sofia, for example, in Bulgaria. So Bulgaria as a land area has no population value because of Sofia, it's a small town, but it's got a resource point. So if some player conquers it, he will be in control of one more resource, and we will be adjusting his production track accordingly. And there are also cities, which are these kind of circles. They've got one population value, and for now I would like you to ignore this one number. We're just focusing on the population value, which is 1 for a city or for a capital city. Examples being Istanbul as a city and Ankara as a capital. So for example, whoever controls Turkey controls 2 population, 1 for Ankara, 1 for Istanbul, and also 1 resource for Izmir. Then we've got the sub-capitals and the main capitals, which have got a population value of 2 and 3 respectively. And each faction has got its own numbered main capitals and sub-capitals. So for the Russians, main capital is Moscow, and it's also got the 2 sub-capitals of Leningrad and Baku in the Caucasus. And then we've got the Axis with its main capital of Berlin and its sub-capitals of Ruhr and Rome. And we've got the Western player with their main capital being at London. And we've also got the sub-capital of Washington for the Americans, and also Paris for France. And lastly, we've got Delhi, which is a Western sub-capital and capital of India as a colony. So for purposes of this tutorial video, these blocks are reveals, these unit blocks, but during a game, during an actual game, these units will not be revealed, they will be hidden, and the orientation will be towards the owning player. So for example, if the Soviet player is this way, then this tank unit will be orientated this way, so that when you reveal it, you reveal also its combat value, which would be a 3 combat value in this case. Respectively, this would be orientated towards the Western player, for example, and this would be orientated, for example, towards the Axis player. And I think it's the right time to have a look at our various kind of units. So we described that this is a fort unit, which only one can be built in its land area. And then we've got two other types of ground units. We've got the tanks and the infantry. So these three are collectively called ground units. The main difference is that this one can be built anywhere, even in colonies or conquered neutrals, for example, unless they are engaged in a fight, for example. And of course they cannot move. They are defensive fortifications. And these two are the other type of units, tanks and infantry, and they can move under the restrictions we're gonna mention later. And all the rest of the units are collectively called ANS units, which stands for air units, naval units, and submarines. So we've got aeroplanes, air forces, and we've got naval units, which are divided into two types, the fleets and carriers. And lastly, we've got submarine units, which can move in a different way. More on that later. So, after the production phase, marker moves to government phase. Again, starting with the player first in turn order, players may take one diplomatic action, which is either play some technology cards or investment cards, or play some diplomacy or action cards. First of all, you can raise your industry levels, because it will help your production further over the next years. So each faction has its own industry costs, which, as we can see, for example, on the Western player, the industry cost starts at 6. So you've got to play investment cards with a factory value of at least 6 in order to raise your industry level by 1. So for example, if you play these 3 cards together, they total a value of 6, so you can raise your industry value by 1 level. And later on, this industry cost might drop. How does it drop? It is when some player declares war on you. So for example, if the German player declares war on you, then you move this marker away. You're not declaring a war onto him so that you flick this marker. He declares war on you, so you move this marker away. And in this case, the USSR in this case has declared war onto the West. And the industry cost level drops from 6 to 5. And if the German player also declares war, this will be moved away as well, and it will drop to 4. And there's one more way of dropping the industry cost for the Western allies, which is if USA joins the war as a Western satellite, which we're going to talk about later. But in this case, the industry cost drops to 3. So a factory value of 3 is sufficient. However, you cannot make change. Upon the time you play an industry value of 4, suppose your industry cost is 3, you don't get any change. These 2 cards go away, they are discarded, and you raise your industry level by 1. The other factions have slightly different industry costs. For example, the German player has got an industry cost of 5, which drops to 4 and 3 respectively upon the time they are declared war upon by the other factions. The declaration of war is only made once. If you declare war onto a faction, then you remain enemies for the rest of the game. It cannot be undone. And lastly, we got the Soviets, which start at an industry cost of 7, but upon being declared war upon, the industry cost drops to 5 and then to 3 if the other faction declares war upon them as well. So that's how you raise your industry, and this can be done a maximum of twice per year, or twice per production phase. So each year you can raise your industry a maximum of twice. And the other options are playing technologies, playing these investment cards for technologies. So let's have some examples. The cards are hidden in our hands and we play them face up or face down in this case. We can play a technology by matching two cards of the same technology. So, for example, look at these cards. They've got two different options in terms of technology. We've got air defense radar and heavy tanks. So each card has two options of which to be played as a technology. So if the Western player, for example, plays two matching cards, both of them have the same technology, in this case air defense radar, he's considered to have played this technology, air defense radar. So one option is to play them face up and show all players that from now on you've got this technology. One of them you keep it face up in front of you and the other one is discarded back to be reshuffled back into the deck. And the other option is to play the technology face down. So you again match the two air defense radar cards and you place them face down in front of you. You are really careful with the orientation so that you are showing that this technology in the upper part is the one you have played, in this case air defense radar. So there are the following options with investment cards. You either play them for their factory values total and then you discard them, or you play them for the technology. Either face up, both of them, you discard one, you keep the other to show you have acquired the technology for the rest of the game. Or the other option is to play them face down, and in this case at any time, at any point in the game, you can reveal it. For example, during a battle where you have air forces fighting some air forces, you may reveal this technology for the air defense radar to give you some air superiority and take your opponent by surprise. So we've got to mention one more thing, that at the end of government phase, after all players have played their investment and action cards they wish to do, then we've got a hand limit and we've got to discard our overhand. So for the Soviet player, the hand limit is 6, as you can see here, and for the Axis player, the hand limit is 7. For the Western player, the hand limit is 8. And for each technology that you have got face down in your so-called secret vault, the hand limit is reduced by 1. So for example, if I have played this technology here, my hand limit is reduced by 1. So at the end of government phase, I have to possibly discard some cards to reach my hand limit again. So there are lastly some other types of technology cards or investment cards, like this one. These ones with the blue background, the teal background, are called Intel cards. These have got some one-off effects, and in this case you are forfeiting their factory value and you are playing them for their effect, which is blindly take one card from a rival's hand in this case. Also, there are cards to reduce your opponent's industry, for example, or even one card that kind of mirrors this effect. You escape this effect and you reflect this event to your opponent. And there are some kind of wild investment cards. So let's have a look at this one. 1938 onwards, so beginning in 1938, this card can be matched with any of the technologies listed below. So if you got one of these technologies, you can match it with this particular card if the year is 1938 or later. Again, you can play those two either face up immediately or face down to reveal them later for some surprise effects. And lastly, we've got this one, which is industrial espionage. This means you can pair it with any reveal deck. So if your opponents have revealed the technology, you can match this with a card in your hand that matches the enemy's technology, and you discard this one and you keep the other technology active for the rest of the game. So it's time to talk a bit about the other deck, which is the action cards. These are mainly for diplomacy. So each card has got two options, which means two possible countries to be played for, and take them by your side diplomatically. And also they indicate some numbers and letters and season. We will be talking about them later, but for now let's focus on the countries or diplomatic options. So each player during their turn in the government phase may play one action card and one action card only, and indicate a neutral nation. So for example, a player may play this card for USA or for Latin America, and you orientate the card accordingly. So if I'm playing this card in front of me, I'm going for Latin America. So in this card we can go for Afghanistan or Hungary, depending on which side I orientated. So when you play this card, we resolve all of them at the end of the government phase. What does this mean? For each card I have played which shows Hungary, I gain one influence over Hungary at the rest of the action phase. And this is when these markers come into play. Each side has its own markers. So we've got these for the Axis, these ones for the Soviets, and this one for the West. So at the end of the government phase, for each card the Axis player, for example, has played for Hungary, they gain one influence over Hungary. So they have played one card, so they gain one influence over Hungary. This means they've got one influence, and this converts them into associates. So there are three possible levels of alliance. A neutral might be either a completely neutral, unaligned one, which has no influence by either power, or they may have one influence. In this case, they are associates. So in this case, they provide you their population and their resource values for your production, but they won't be joining the war, they won't be helping you militarily. So from now on, starting with the next year, the Axis player will have one more population and one more resource to play with because of the associates of Hungary. The second level of influence is the so-called protectorate, and the third level of influence, if at the end of the government phase there is a third influence marker, this is flipped upside down, and we've got satellites. So in this case, Hungary is an Axis satellite, which means they have now joined the war in the Axis side. So upon a neutral being converted to satellite, they deploy units as well. Still, they provide their resource and population values, but they also deploy units for the sake of the Axis. So what units can they deploy? It depends on their capital's master value. And now we go back to this chart and we consult this column. So depending on whether it is a town or a city or a capital city, which you can see with these icons, they deploy the correspondent master value. So for the Hungarian example, we've got the city of Budapest, which has got a value of 2. So they deploy a 2 combat value unit, which might be of any type. So for example, it might be an Axis air force, or it might be an Axis infantry, for example, or even an Axis fort. So upon converting Hungary into a satellite, you as an Axis player will choose one unit and will place it hidden towards your side. Only you can see it. Its master value is 1 if the capital is a town, like in the case of Belgrade, or 2 if it is Hungary. And there are also countries that deploy many units, like for example Turkey. So in the case of Turkey, if you manage to convert Turkey diplomatically, you place this marker in the capital of the nation to show it is your satellite, and you deploy a 3 combat value unit in Ankara, which is a capital city with a master value of 3, also a 2 combat value one in Istanbul, which is just a city, and one combat value 1 in Izmir, which is a town. If there is only 2 influence, then this country is a protectorate, which means, again, like associates, they provide you the population and the resource values. They are not yet satellites, they have not actively joined the war by your side, but the only difference from associates is that if they are attacked by another player, they are immediately converted into satellites. So you get this third influence point for free, and from now on they join the war by your side, and you can immediately deploy the units. So for example, if a Western player attacks Ankara when Turkey is a protectorate, in this case, the units will be deployed and this will be converted into a satellite. So you can immediately deploy your units and start battling them. The nationality of the units deployed is always the great powers one. So, for example, in this case, it will be a German player's unit. It will not be the Italian players. For example, in the Western case, it will be a British unit, not a French one deployed, because it's the great power gaining influence and not the major powers. When saying major powers, I mean the kind of secondary allies in the name of Italy, France, and the USA. And I would also like to point out that during production, you are also restricted in the nationality of the units you produce. So, for example, if you build a fort in this area, which you have gained diplomatically or militarily as the German player, you may build a fort in Adana, for example, but it will be a German one, not an Italian one. Italian ones can only be built in Italy, in its home territory, or if it is a fort, only in their colonies, in Libya, for example. And for the French player, also, French units are only built during production in France and in French North Africa or Syria, which are the colonies. In all other cases, when you build units during production, or when you deploy units by diplomatically gaining an ally, it will be the great powers units. So British or German units respectively. So what happens when multiple players go for influence in one country? First of all, if a player plays Hungary, so for example if the Axis player plays Hungary in front of them, other players may also play Hungary, and in this case, let's suppose that the Western player also plays Hungary during the government phase. In this case, both Hungaries go away, they are discarded and they are reshuffled into the deck during the next new year. Of course, one player may play more than 3 Hungaries, for example, and at the end of the government phase, during the resolution, we add the corresponding markers. If there is already an influence marker existent in the capital, an influence marker of the opponent, I mean, first we remove the opponent's marker and then we add our own, depending on how many cards we played for said neutral. So of course you can play more than 3 cards for the same ally, but for the most part you will trying to gain a maximum of 3 influence over an ally. You will notice that there is also USA in the cards. USA is a special case. I mean, they cannot join the Soviets or the Germans, but we are going to talk about USA diplomacy at a later point of the tutorial. And also, there are some wild cards. So let's have a look at this one, or even better, this one. So if we look at this one, Birds of a Feather, it has got a list of possible neutrals, which will join its side, depending on the faction. So for the Western player, it is USA, Norway, or Denmark, or Sweden. So you play this card instantly, one off, you discard it, and in this case, you instantly place your influence marker, upon the one neutral you have selected, be it USA or Norway or somebody else. And if it is the Axis player, they've got a different list, and if it is USSR, they have also got a different list of possible allies joining their side. In all these cases, you play this card, you discard it, and you place your marker instantly. And again, at the end of the government phase, this may gain you an ally, or this influence marker may possibly be removed. Other wild cards are this one, for example, Fear and Loathing. In this case, you remove a rival influence marker from one of the neutral nations listed after the rival. So not listed after you, but listed after the rival, rather. So in this example, if you are the Axis player, you may play it to remove one Western influence from the following countries. Or if you are the Western player, you may play it to remove one influence marker from the following countries. And again, we are talking influence marker, not an influence that has been played and will be resolved at the end of the phase, but we mean already present influence markers. You can remove those. Also, there are some special cards like isolationism, where you can remove one rival influence from some particular countries, or foreign aid, during which we can reduce your industry to provide aid to the allies and thus increase your influence by one in the neutral nation you select. And in all these cases, you discard these cards and you place your influence marker. You don't wait for the end of the resolution phase. But even so, even if you have placed 3 influence markers like this, you don't gain this ally immediately. You will wait for the government's phase resolution in order to determine who gets to be an ally and who isn't. Lastly, each player in his turn may opt to pass without playing any action card or any investment card. In this case, the pass is soft, which means he can play later on, but if all 3 players in succession pass, then the government phase ends and we move to the resolution and then the seasons. So whenever a player opts to play neither an action card nor an investment card, they may pass, and then turn moves on to the next player. And the next player may play something, and then a player who passed may play in a subsequent turn until all players pass. And at this point, the government phase ends, and players who have an overhand, which means more card than their hand limit, have to discard their overhand. So typically, the player which currently is holding the most overhand is the one to play his cards in succession, and then at the point when all players have the same overhand, they alternate playing one card each.